Hello and welcome to today's webinar. It's great to see some familiar faces on this call. Today is the second webinar in a series of capacity building webinars hosted by Sea Alliance in collaboration with Global Tuna Alliance, World Benchmarking Alliance, and Fishwise. My name is Garrett Okrasinski, and I'm a project director on the social responsibility team at Fishwise, and I'll be facilitating the presentation today. Fishwise is a nonprofit consultancy with a mission to sustain ocean ecosystems and the people who depend on them by transforming global seafood supply chains. Today, we'll be discussing human rights due diligence in depth, focusing on identify, assess, and remediate. On the next slide, you will see this is the series of webinars. The next one will be on responsible recruitment, worker engagement, decent work at sea, and then we'll finish off with putting knowledge into action and talking about responsible sourcing practices. On the agenda today, we'll be hearing from Omnia Strategy on upcoming human rights due diligence regulations. Then we'll hear from the World Benchmarking Alliance on the foundations, on the steps of human rights due diligence and the indicators they use to benchmark companies. We'll then hear from Marks & Spencer and Waitrose on examples of human rights due diligence and the lessons they have learned. Finally, we'll close out with Oxfam on an essential element of human rights due diligence, which is remedy. Okay, it's a lot to cover in an hour, so let's get it started. I'm gonna hand it over to Adam Smith-Anthony, who's a partner and the head of business and human rights for Omnia Strategy. Adam advises and represents businesses on matters of corporate responsibility and business and human rights, providing legal, communications, and commercial support. Immediately following his comments, we're gonna jump right into question and answer, so please be prepared to do that. Thank you, Adam, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Garrett. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. Really grateful to the organisers for the invitation, and very nice to meet you all in this modern fashion. I'm only going to take a few minutes just to provide a kind of scene-setting contextual piece with a real kind of high-level look at the regulatory approach and recent history, with a focus on 3 points. First, where did this all start from a soft law point of view? Second, a string of recent national laws, and thirdly, and most topically, this new draft directive that's currently being negotiated at the EU, and which could have a transformative effect. So for present purposes, although human rights due diligence does have a kind of longer history and pedigree, for our purposes, we can start in 2011 with the adoption unanimously by the UN Human Rights Council of the UN Guiding Principles. And you may be familiar with these. They effectively set out 3 pillars, one focused on the obligations, duty of the state to protect human rights, and the second, that we'll be more focused on today, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So this kind of non-binding sense that companies had a role to play, almost indirectly affected by the state's duty to protect human rights. And then the third pillar was this combined obligation to deliver effective remedy. So that second pillar really gives the start to our story on human rights due diligence, and it sets out exactly those points that Garrett mentioned and were on our opening slides. So the idea that you need to identify, assess, remediate, and then indeed report on your human rights impacts. UN Guiding Principles, very, very principles-based. So it leaves a lot for companies to figure out for themselves about how exactly to deliver this in practice. It does say it should be risk-based and based on a process of prioritization. So you're not expected to do all things straight away. The OECD then has added some kind of flesh to the bones, and in particular has focused in part on the seafood industry and highlighted 3 main areas of concern and activity. One, labour rights and human rights. So there we're looking at child labour, women's rights, particularly in processing industry, working conditions and living wage. Secondly, food safety and public health. And thirdly, environment. So these are some of the main issues perhaps that are already on your mind. So then the UNGPs talked about this idea of a smart mix of regulatory and enforcement approaches to be taken by states. And we have seen this playing out in the passage of national legislation with a focus for now on Europe, particularly Western Europe. First, really, this came in France in 2017 with a law called the Duty of Vigilance Act. And then more recently, we've seen Germany and Norway incorporate mandatory human rights due diligence provisions into their national law. And very many other states, again, predominantly in Europe, but not only, are looking at ways to legislate in a similar way. So that brings us on to the EU. Now, the EU, as part of its broader Green Deal suite of regulations and different measures, has been for some years now working away on this draft directive called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. First introduced as a concept in early 2020 by the European Commission, and we finally, through after a couple of false starts, got a draft of this earlier this year. So what did it say? Well, the highlights are as follows, and then I'll let you guide me on questions based on what's most interesting to you. Firstly, in terms of scope, it addresses three categories of companies who are in scope. One, basically very, very large EU-based companies. Secondly, large EU-based companies in specific markets, so a lower threshold in terms of net turnover and employees there. And then thirdly, and interestingly, those companies incorporated outside of the EU, but who either reach a certain size or have a certain volume of their turnover all generated in the single market. Key, though, is that the idea that not only will those in-scope companies be directly affected, but there'll be a huge indirect effect on other companies in their supply chains. That is because the in-scope companies will have a direct obligation to conduct this human rights due diligence. That would cover their own operations, their subsidiaries' operations, so tier one supply chain, and this is slightly controversial and may change, the value chains of, quote, established business relationship. Now, exactly what this means is rather unknown and still to be worked out. But effectively, this process as a whole requires you to integrate a human rights due diligence system, identify impacts, prevent and mitigate harms, remediate and end those harms when you can, and to report. So it broadly tracks the kind of UNGP's outline of what human rights due diligence means, but there have been some departures, and that's why many people are still calling on this to be refined during the legislative process. Certain companies, only those group one very large companies, have additional climate change obligations or would do under this law. It touches on directors' duty, but really avoided this for the most part. And the directors' duties that are introduced by this directive are really limited to establishing and maintaining and improving over time this human rights due diligence system. So what about enforcement? Well, there are two ways in which these obligations would be enforced if the directive is passed in its current form. The first is administrative enforcement, and there you're looking at the designated authorities within each member state having a supervisory enforcement role. So you're thinking about fines and other compliance orders. And secondly, the idea of civil liability. So it would require member states to ensure that victims of human rights abuses, or more specifically, victims of harm caused by companies' failure to have this human rights due diligence process informed to a high enough level, should then have a route to compensation. Again, what this means in practice and how you differentiate this failure to have a human rights due diligence mechanism that's up to spec with who's responsible for the ultimate human rights harm will take some time to play out. So where are we with this? Well, it's currently being negotiated. The European Parliament is a little bit less comfortable with it than their counterparts at the Council of the EU. Council seems to be pushing ahead and quite keen to proceed with maybe just a few tweaks. The European Parliament has started to talk about rethinking fundamental areas of this, and in particular, requiring companies to have a view beyond their tier one suppliers and also rethinking the idea that you can just have contractual assurances and relationships and then say that's all fine. You have to be. They would want to see more proactive requirements on companies to make sure that impacts are tracked through rather than just relying on contractual provisions. So we'll wait and see. The directive, if it is passed, some way out yet, probably at least a year before we'll see any final text, and then typically a 2-year process for that being transposed into national law. So let me wrap up there, a real whistle-stop tour, but if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
Great, thank you very much, Adam, for that. Yeah, I know it's a lot to fit into a short amount of time, but please, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A. Also, if you have questions for him later, we can make sure we'll circle back and get those answered for you. But while you're submitting questions, I just had a question around if there's a lot of discussion around the roles and effectiveness of social audits as a part of human rights due diligence. Do you have any thoughts on how the EU legislation or other similar legislation might affect the role of audits?
So audits, I think, are not a panacea. That's the main point. I think some people think they can rely on a social audit, get someone in once in a blue moon, and kind of have then a plausible deniability of any other problems going on. The real issue with social audits is the ability to uncover real harms and real adverse impacts going on. So there are stories of social audits where factories or processing plants simply know that people are arriving. They usher all the child labor or undocumented labor around the corner into the next building and then leave them there for the day until they come back. So you need something that provides a much more holistic view of what's going on. The extent to which the EU directive will require that in practice remains to be seen, but certainly I think as currently drafted, relying on social audits without a real sense that they are effective would not meet the threshold that's being introduced.
Great, thank you for that. I do see another question of what would be considered tier 1 in this legislation, where the principal places their purchase orders. I was wondering if you could talk about that scope.
So here you're really looking at whether you have a contractual relationship at all. So it could be based on all manner of things, whether that is placing orders, whether it's some kind of provision of services, or indeed provision of raw materials and ingredients. The idea around beyond tier 1 is really that once you don't have that contractual relationship anymore, and you're thinking about subcontractors of those with whom you do have a direct relationship, the ability to control this by contractual provisions and even kind of commercial leverage dramatically reduces. So companies need to be much more imaginative, A, in terms of how they can approach those tier 2 beyond companies, and B, how they can effectively build up the capability of their tier 1 suppliers to pass on some of that good practice and increasingly compliant practice all the way down the supply and value chains.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. At this time, I don't see any other questions. I think we're digesting a lot. And so a few more may pop up throughout that we'll make sure we circle back with you to make sure they get answered. But thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you walking us through that in detail. My pleasure. Thank you. Great. So now we're going to hear from Helen Packer in the Seafood Stewardship lead for the World Benchmarking Alliance. She will elaborate on the key steps of human rights due diligence and what are some of the indicators they're looking at to measure progress against some of the foundational steps. We will drop that index in the chat so you guys can review that after the webinar, but I'll let you take it away, Helen. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Garrett, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this webinar. So as Garrett mentioned, I lead the Seafood Stewardship Index at the World Benchmarking Alliance, which assesses the 30 most influential companies in the seafood sector on a range of social and environmental topics, including human rights due diligence. So today I will present to you the indicators we use to assess companies on their human rights due diligence process, as well as their stakeholder engagement within that process, and the grievance mechanisms they have in place. So the reasons I'm presenting those indicators is that first, they provide guideposts, useful guideposts for companies in terms of what to aim for, but also I think framing for today's intervention. So next slide, please. So I don't need to remind you that under the UNGP that Adam just mentioned, companies have an internationally recognized responsibility to respect human rights. So although the UNGP break down human rights due diligence into 4 steps, we've broken it down into 5 steps, as you can see on the figure here. And the reason for that is that the steps of identifying and assessing merit a separate analysis, because identifying means identifying overall risks, the types of risks by location or activities, while assessing means defining which ones are the most salient. And based on our experience assessing on this topic, assessing companies, we often see companies meeting the first but not the second step, which is why we assess those 2 separately. So our indicators cover the first 3 steps. So those are identifying, assessing, and integrating, as they form the foundation of the due diligence process. So next slide, please. So here you see the requirements of the human rights due diligence indicators in more detail. So the first step of identifying human rights and impacts, we expect companies to describe the processes in place to identify its human rights risks and impacts in specific locations or activities, covering its own operations as well as its supply chains. For the second step, we expect companies to describe the process for assessing its human rights risks and disclosing what it considers to be its salient human rights issues, meaning those that are at risk of the most severe negative impacts. And for the third step, we expect companies to describe its global system to take action to prevent, mitigate, or remediate its salient human rights issues. And this includes a description of how this global system also applies to its supply chain. Next slide, please. And next slide as well. So we have a separate indicator which looks at how companies engage with affected and potentially affected stakeholders as part of that human rights due diligence process that I just described. So those stakeholders depend on the nature of the company's operation, but they can include workers, families, local communities, and any other person or group that whose life or an environment may be impacted. So element A, as you can see here, asks the company to disclose the categories of stakeholders whose human rights have been or may be affected by its activities. And element B requires that the company provides at least 2 examples of its engagement with stakeholders whose human rights have been or may be affected, which means engaging in a dialogue either directly with the stakeholders or with their legitimate representative, or within a sort of multi-stakeholder initiative. And next slide, please. So access to remedy is a human right in itself, and therefore a core part of respecting human rights. So unless a company actively engages in a remediation of adverse impacts it has caused or contributed to, it cannot fully meet its responsibility to respect human rights. So negative human rights impacts may occur despite a company's best efforts, given the complexity of activities and business relationships involved. The companies need to be prepared for this so they can respond quickly and effectively. So to be able to provide remedy, companies should enable access to grievance mechanisms to manage complaints and concerns from workers, external individuals, and communities, with user involvement in the mechanism's design and performance. So and this is very important, which is why I underline this. And companies should be transparent about how the mechanism operates and the fact that they do not impede access to either state-based or international mechanisms. So we have 2 indicators related to grievance mechanisms, one focused on workers and one focused on external individuals and communities, but they're very similar in terms of requirements. So the expectation here is that companies have 1 or more channels in place that is accessible to all workers, external individuals, and communities to raise complaints or concerns related to the company. So an explicit reference to human rights is not required, but it must be clear to stakeholders that a channel designed to cover other topics, for example, corruption hotline, can also be used to raise human rights complaints as well. And finally, a mechanism that is purely anonymous does not meet this indicator as well, because it doesn't necessarily provide access to remedy for affected individuals. So next slide, and that was my last slide. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope this helps the discussion moving forward. Back to you, Gat.
Thank you, Helen. I appreciate that. Yeah, not only walking through the foundational steps of identify, assess, and integrate, but really, talking about the importance of stakeholder engagement, remedy, and grievance mechanisms. So thank you for highlighting those. And next we'll be hearing from Marks and Spencer. They're responsible sourcing managers. They're going to elaborate. Unfortunately, they weren't able to participate today, so they're kind enough to record a video that we will be sharing with you guys, as well as a link to the full video will be up on the Sea Alliance website. So please check that out. But they're kind enough to record this video for us around their human rights due diligence and remedy guidance that they have created and shared with their suppliers. We will also drop a link in the chat.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having us. We're really sorry you can't be there in person. We're here today from M&S to talk you through our human rights and due diligence remedy guidance. Just to introduce ourselves, my name is Heather Cadden. I'm one of the responsible sourcing managers in the human rights team looking after our fresh business.
My name's Debora Johnson. I'm responsible sourcing manager for Ambient, so looking after our tinned fish supply chains. We thought that it would be really useful to give you a quick background and overview of why we developed the Human Rights Due Diligence Guidance and Toolkit. In 2021, M&S as a business updated our human rights standard and requirements for suppliers. These outlined a new expectation for suppliers to be developing their own approach to human rights due diligence. And broadly, these expectations were also part of preparing for due diligence legislation requirements that we're all aware of. While all suppliers are now expected to be developing their own approaches to HRDD, in 2021, we asked a nominated set of suppliers to present their approaches to us, to all our teams. These reviews included our top 30 supplier partners of high-risk products from a human rights perspective, and this work between supplier partners and our M&S commercial, technical and human rights teams, we feel is transforming how M&S colleagues build human rights into business decisions. The first year of these due diligence review meetings focused on information gathering and awareness raising, but already we see an increased appetite for further action, both internally and from our supplier partners. We've shared our learnings from our first year with our supplier partners to drive forward our programme next year, and we'll conduct a similar series of reviews each year. So to support all our suppliers on their HRDD journey, we created this specific guidance toolkit on HRDD and remedy. It was really designed to be a comprehensive toolkit, drawing together all the resources and experiences out there from across sectors, not just food, and includes critical questions to reflect on when undertaking HRDD. A couple of key points to call out. While the guidance was developed by the M&S team and Louise Herring, it had huge amounts of supplier input. So we formed working groups for each of the sections made up of several supplier partners, really ensuring that it could be anchored in real supply chain experience. It was created to help suppliers develop an HRDD approach for their own company. So it's not designed to be a prescriptive guide, but instead to be used more as a reference for each business and to help our suppliers develop their own approach that works best for their business. It also doesn't aim to have all the answers. In the guidance, we try to cover all the key areas and link to existing guidance to avoid duplication. It can also be downloaded and read all in one go or split up into sections so suppliers can read the bits that are most useful and relevant to them. So we launched the guidance and toolkit in 2021 with a series of supporting webinars for suppliers depending on where they felt they were at the start of their HRDD journey, making good progress or well advanced. Then in 2022, understanding the importance of collaboration and not reinventing the wheel in this important space, we made the guidance open source. Heather will now dive into some of the specifics of the content and how it might be useful to you.
So as you might have just seen, we have got our maturity framework, which we've used with our suppliers to really help them on that journey. And as Deborah discussed, it's not there to be a prescriptive or a tick box exercise, but it's there to really help suppliers at all parts of their journey on human rights, either being really advanced and having it embedded into their business, or really starting at the beginning to help them understand how they can start on what can be a very challenging journey. And this is just an opportunity for our suppliers to help assess themselves and really understand where they sit along other businesses and where their business really falls within the human rights due diligence space. One area we really want to focus on the guidance is what we think is probably one of the most important places to start, how to begin. So when you are picking up something like a guidance that is thorough as this one, it's sometimes really challenging to know where you need to begin and where it fits within your business, because some businesses have a lot larger supply chains, a lot more complexity, and some they can sit and really take it back to those basics and understand where do you really start when considering this. So this section is very much about how do you begin understanding where your influences are and where your business sits within that maturity framework. A big part about that is also understanding the risk in your own operations. There can be the challenge that people always go beyond that and start thinking about their supply chains first, but actually starting your own operations can help model where that can go within your supply chain. It can help you share those learnings through the process. So this section is an area we really recommend you go through and have a look at first, because it will help understand where to start, and then it gives you the opportunity to sort of skip through the guidance and not have to go through all the elements that you've already covered or you know that you're already well ahead of in the processes that you have.
Great, thank you to Deborah and
Hi,
Heather.
everyone. Thank you
For those comments. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here, but happy to answer questions. So please make sure you record those in the chat or in the question and answer. So now we'll hear from Andrea and Melissa at Waitrose and Partners, and they're going to share a specific in-depth example of human rights due diligence in the UK fishing sector and what they discovered in the process.
Good afternoon, I'm Melissa Tillotson, Senior Aquaculture and Fisheries Manager at Waitrose.
Hi, I'm Andrea Crichton, Human Rights Manager at Waitrose and John Lewis Partnership. So Melissa and I are here today to talk to you about promoting worker voice in the UK fishing industry.
So, for over 20 years, Waitrose has been leading the way with the responsible sourcing of fish. However, we recognise that you can't have responsible fish strategy without also looking after the people who catch the fish. For many years, we've heard about the horrific human rights in the fishing sector globally, the most profile of which would have been those documented off the coast of Thailand. We wanted to carry out research into some of the challenges in the sector to gain a better understanding of the situation. At the time of doing the research, there was a lot of effort being put into understanding how best to hear the voice of the fishermen and crew. However, these efforts have often been restricted because of the inherent problems with logistics and, of course, ensuring the ongoing safety of the participants. As a partnership built on the premise of partner or worker voice, we felt we could be in a good position to work with our suppliers and trial a pilot programme to look at the challenges. The first stage of this was to understand where best to focus the research. Whilst we considered a number of countries, the final decision was made to look at the UK. And whilst the UK is not the highest risk country from where we source, it is also not the lowest risk either. We were also aware before starting the research that encouraging people to speak to the researchers might be a challenge. Focusing research on the UK meant that researchers could easily travel to the location and speak directly to these people. It's also, of course, important that we don't just turn a blind eye to what is happening locally and make possible assumptions that situations in the UK may or may not be accurate. Some of the key challenges we identified in the UK fishing industry were a lack of visibility and clear understanding of the work carried out, and ability to monitor this because of isolation at sea. Inherent vulnerabilities of the workers, specifically relating to migrant crew and high health and safety risks in the fishing sector. And we also understood there to be an absence of effective communication channels between fisheries and management. So, in developing the pilot project, we identified the following objectives. First, we wanted to develop an understanding of the key issues facing migrant crew in the UK and their worker journey. Secondly, looking at the existing worker voice mechanisms available at sea and understanding their effectiveness. And finally, using these learnings to then help identify positive next steps and tangible actions. So looking at designing a scalable and, more importantly, worker voice model that is replicable and we could trial further within Waitrose wild caught fish supply chains. Over to Andrea to tell you a little bit more.
So we considered locations all over the UK, but really we had specific criteria about who it was we wanted to interview. So non-European Economic Area migrant workers are the ones with the greatest vulnerabilities, and the transit visa system has inherent risks associated with it, as workers clearly have fewer rights. We did look at splitting the research up across the UK. We considered whether to do 2 completely different locations, maybe one in the south coast of England, another northern Scotland. But looking up at the makeup of the workforce across both of those areas, eventually we decided that workers on transit visas were most likely to be in the Scottish ports. So that's where we went. And it's worth saying that we deliberately did not conduct the research with a requirement that the crew interviewed were directly connected to our own supply chains. And we did that really because we were adamant that we wanted the maximum opportunity for individuals to be able to speak to us honestly. So our researchers focused their efforts on speaking to crew who met the profile we were looking for. They identified people for interview at random and really on port walks. And the researchers also interviewed skippers and recruitment agents. And we had 3 local organisations who provided quite valuable insight and actually introduced the researchers to some of the interview participants as well. Now, the findings from these worker interviews were both positive and negative, and they were directly based on the experiences of the crew who were interviewed. So solely based on worker testimony, what they show for us is a little bit of a snapshot of what workers' experiences were in Scotland. They capture both past and present, and at the time of the research, there'd also been COVID in the mix as well. So the findings haven't been verified or triangulated, as it were, with other sources. This was purely a mechanism by which these crew could have a voice and have their experiences heard. So the research didn't include any physical inspection of vessels or documentation either. Now, on the positive findings, these included, top of the list, earning a higher income than in their home. Being paid a full salary during the low season, bearing in mind COVID-19 as well, and also during repairs at port. So they were highlighted. Some of the crew interviewed were happy that there was sufficient health and safety measures in place on the vessels. They liked other things like being able to cook their own food, good working relations with the crew and the skipper, and they cited the ability to access free and reliable Wi-Fi connections whilst they were on board. Now, obviously, there was a flip side as well. So the negative findings were that workers highlighted they were often fundamentally not prepared for the psychological and physical hardship of working at sea, particularly in the harsh weather conditions that they faced off the Scottish coast. And more than 75% had worked an average of up to 20 hours a day continually across 3 or 4 weeks without proper rest. Now, some reported that there was adequate health and safety provisions on vessels, but approximately 40% either personally sustained injuries or witnessed other people being injured on UK vessels. So also, nearly a third of them interviewed expressed experienced some verbal abuse by the skipper and or the Scottish crew, things like being shouted and sworn at, people being dismissive feeling belittled, and in some cases it also included racial abuse. Another key finding was excessive working hours. So the crew felt that the hours they were having to work when they arrived in the UK were far higher than they'd understood that they would work before they came to the UK. So crew weren't paid overtime, which means that their hourly wages are lower than they would have expected based on the remuneration package that they'd agreed before leaving home. That was a really big thing. And recruitment fees were also flagged as high-risk area, with fees being paid by those interviewed ranging from nothing all the way up to more than £2,000. So in terms of next steps, the key recommendation from the research was to create films which were going to support workers on their journey to the UK, because it was going to help them understand both their rights and where to go for help, and a little bit about the experience, how it's going to be. So we've done that. We've commissioned a set of films to be made imminently, actually, and we're working across the industry. So we're including stakeholders from the NGOs and the trade union representatives. Filming's taking place in a couple of weeks' time in November, and those films are planned to be released in January 23. So not far away now. Stage 2 then is to ensure that we can effectively distribute these films. We're looking at different tech solutions. We'll also be working with our suppliers who can access, for example, Facebook groups, local government offices, local NGOs, local unions, etc. Now, the proposal for measuring the impact does remain a challenge. We're looking to pilot a programme with a few fisheries who will hopefully engage with us throughout the entire recruitment process. So what we're looking to do is show the films to potential workers before they leave home, get those who've watched the films to answer some questions over a period of time, and that should help establish what it is that they've learned and how they've used the information that they've been provided with. So alongside all of this, we've been looking at how we can support the implementation of truly responsible recruitment practices through wild-caught fish supply chains. And the current changes in government policy do mean that that just continues to be quite a moving target.
Great, and there is more to both of those industry videos. So again, we'll make sure you guys have the link to those so you can watch them in full, but would like to thank thank them for sending those videos and helping move this conversation along with specific examples. And I know we're looking forward to those films coming out and seeing how impactful they can be. So finally, I want to discuss an essential element of remedy. So I'm going to introduce Monica Romis, a private sector human rights advisor for Oxfam. Monica works with Oxfam Business Advisory Services and engages with companies to improve their policies and practices related to human rights and their supply chain. Thanks, Monica, for being with us. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Garrett, and hi everyone. Very happy to be here and to discuss this important topic. Like Garrett said, I'm Monica Romis, work at the Oxfam Business Advisory Service, which is a relatively new unit in Oxfam GB in the UK, providing direct assistance to companies who want to improve their journey on human rights in their supply chains. So starting, we can go to the next slide if you can. This is just to show you, just to set the scene and show you a selection of some of the research that Oxfam has conducted over the past 10 years or so, looking at human rights in the seafood sector. We've done this research in collaboration with local and regional civil society organizations. We have also worked through our colleagues based in Asia, in Southeast Asia, to run programs to support workers in the seafood sector. And also in the UK, we have asked supermarkets to take responsibility for their practices that can have an impact on these workers. So the seafood sector has been one of the focus areas behind the Barcodes campaign that some of you might know. Going to the next slide, what we found through this research won't be new to you. Some of the risks that are prevalent in the sector. I just want to spend a moment here looking at some of them to bring them to life in terms of the reality that the workers are facing and that are the focus of our discussion today. These are two examples from the interviews that we conducted through our research, one from a worker on a fishing vessel, which we just heard can be dangerous and very isolated place of work, and one from a processing worker describing the conditions of overwork in their workplace. We just heard also from Andrea some other examples. So these are just these just typify some of the biggest issues in the sector, but there are other risks like excessive working hours, fee-based recruitment processes, low wages, withholding of wages and retention of IDs, and unsafe and degrading working environment, for example. So moving to the next slide, so in light of all these concrete risks that I just reviewed, the reason we're here today is carrying out a robust human rights due diligence is imperative. Here I'm showing the graph from the OECD, which has been referenced also by from the previous panelist. And I want to highlight the importance of raising grievances and provide access to remedy as an important step, but also outcome of any good human rights due diligence process, which is also required by the UNGPs, like Anthony said before. So in this process is really key to promote a meaningful participation of rights holders, civil society organizations, and workers, including them in the design of the remedy. So it's really, we want to emphasize here that it's important that companies, both buyers and suppliers, include consultation and engagement with workers and other representatives like civil society organizations in these processes, and ensure that there is space, especially for vulnerable groups, to have their voice heard. Moving to the next slide. So how do we do that? How do we ensure that workers do have access to remedy when their rights are violated? Here I'm gonna just spend a few minutes on this last slide and highlight three main areas, main points. First, like it was said by Helen and others before, workers need to have access to an effective grievance mechanism in place. Our research and experience on the ground in the seafood sector tells us that this is still a weak spot and a challenge. Seafood workers often are not even aware of their rights, especially if they're coming from particularly vulnerable groups, and they're not aware of the existence of grievance mechanism at the workplace, even if maybe they exist there on paper. At the Oxfam Business Advisory Service, we have recently done lots of work actually in this area, not specifically on the seafood, but in agriculture and manufacturing. We learned a lot. So I wanted to share here some of the key learnings that we think are important. First of all, grievance mechanisms need to be designed and implemented in collaboration with the potentially affected people, which are the intended users of this mechanism, which will ensure that the channels and the mechanism chosen really meet the needs of the intended users, are in a format that workers can understand, access, and ultimately trust, which is the main element for then using a grievance mechanism and have them effectively working on place. And as part of the engagement process with affected people, companies should really set out to engage and hear from vulnerable groups, specifically women, migrant workers who might face additional barriers for participating in these processes. And also what we learn is that it's really important in order to have meaningful participation from workers, it's key to empowering them with the skills, the tools, and the time needed. It won't happen overnight, especially in contexts maybe where there aren't strong worker organizations or a strong awareness of workers' rights. Really empower workers with the skills to be able to participate in these processes, and also to increase increase legitimacy of grievance mechanism, it is important that they are somewhat independent from company management, and this is done with trying to do that by involving directly workers and intended users also in the implementation, in the governance of the mechanism, having workers involved in the day-to-day implementation creates that trust and legitimacy of the mechanism towards the rest of the workers. Also, it's important to guarantee confidentiality when needed, and to protect workers from fears of victimization or reprisal, and really working with local civil society organizations to provide support, again, especially in those places where there isn't a strong representation of workers already in place. And finally, on this point, to track grievances and communicating results back to workers when a grievance has been received and handled and then resolved, also communicating back, which will ultimately increase trust and transparency and trust in the mechanism. Second point, also to ensure that remediation is provided in a satisfactory manner, is important to involve workers also in identifying the solution to the problems that have been raised. So affected people should not be treated just as recipients, but really companies should work with rights holders to identify the best solution to provide remedy and to consult on the remediation plan. This means also in the seafood sector to involve trusted civil society organization that can also help in monitoring the remedial actions that are being provided, and see if the plan is being implemented according to satisfaction. And related to this, also monitor effectiveness, satisfaction of the remedy, and effectiveness in this case should be assessed by considering the perspective of the affected people on the workers, and making sure that human rights are restored. And again, when identifying remedy and solutions, it's important to keep in mind that there are always strong power imbalances between workers and the company, and so any remedial action should take those in mind and try to redress these balances. And then third point, in terms of also of providing remedy, so remedy could be provided through grievance mechanism, right, and addressing specific issues that come to the surface. But also, we're aware that there are impacts and abuses that are endemic and was widespread in the sector, and that actually companies could be more proactive and could try to address the root causes of these impacts. So, for example, we've known now that the freedom of association as being a really critical point in the sector. The bargaining power of workers has been declining over the years. And even when trade unions are present, they're often excluded by discussion on wages and working conditions. So it's really important to address this issue, to address the imbalance of power between workers and the employers, and increase worker representation and collective bargaining power, so that issues can actually be addressed before they become big problems. Similar root cause is the unfair distribution of value in the seafood supply chain, which Oxfam has researched for some years now. So companies, again, could take steps into addressing this issue, for example, by taking meaningful steps towards paying a living wage and ensuring that suppliers offer a fair remuneration to their workers. And provide and again enabling workers to have adequate information about their rights and about their opportunity to access social and legal protections, for example. There are other systemic actions that could be taken, that companies could be taking, for example, reviewing their purchasing practices that can have an impact on workers' conditions, or commit and implement the employer pays principle, as we discussed discussed about the problem with the recruitment fees. So just not waiting for problems to really become intractable, but start working towards eliminating some of those factors that are at the cause of the problems. I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, so much. And thank you for staying on for question and answer too. So I'm sure we'll have some more discussion around that. It's a really key element that needs to be addressed as part of human rights due diligence. So moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to that was a lot to move through in an hour, and we just wanted to kind of pull out some of the key takeaways. These will also be dropped in the chat, so you can copy and paste them into your notes if you're taking any. But mandatory human rights due diligence and stakeholder expectations are accelerating the need to establish these internal processes that we're discussing today. Establishing proactive processes to identify, assess, and remedy is essential to human rights due diligence. As we heard from a few of our speakers today, meaningful stakeholder engagement in identifying and assessing impacts will increase the chances of these processes being successful. And then finally, developing an effective and transparent, trusted grievance and remediation process will enable companies to prevent and respond to these abuses. So before we head to question and answer with this recap in mind, I want to move to the next slide where we talk about, just kind of breaking it down with a call to action of, if you have a minute, please sign up for the next webinar and write down a new piece of information. We'll also drop that link in the chat. If you have 5 minutes, share this recording and email some of the resources that we have placed in the chat. And remember, we'll follow up too with the links to the webinars where they live on the Sea Alliance site. If you have 15 to 30 minutes, identify which elements of human rights due diligence your company is already conducting. But if you have a little bit more time, like an hour, maybe identify the opportunities to expand these processes to include meaningful stakeholder engagement. And if you have more time, like a day, consider working with a consultant to ID your next steps and to draft a remediation process. So with that, I'm going to try to launch a poll just to kind of recap or to highlight, those actions and see where some of you are thinking you have capacity to focus your efforts. So I'm going to leave that open for a few seconds. Okay, I see we're getting close to the hour, so I'm going to end that poll. Thank you for participating. Seems like we're fairly spread across the board there, with a lot of us maybe being pressed for time and only having a minute to spare today. But we look forward to having you participate in the next webinar. And it's also great to see that this did provide some more insight. So thank you for joining and for staying on for questions. So we have Helen, Monica, and Andy from Sea Alliance that are going to be able to answer some questions. As we approach the hour, and if you have to drop off for another call or a meeting, please make sure you drop your questions into the Q&A feature, and the speakers will stay on, and we'll make sure you get your answers addressed, and you can check back and see it on the recording. So with that, Monica, I do have a question here for you. So where there are improvements in policies and practices by retailers or brands, are there ways to track how these flow through to direct impact on workers?
That is the $1 million question. Yeah, so I don't have a direct answer, but both us as Oxfam, but also I know several companies and organizational companies are looking into that. What is then the direct impact on workers when we change policy and practices? When, as Oxfam, when we do our work, when we, for example, work with a company and try to improve what they do, we do it by engaging with the affected people, being a community or workers. So we identify what is the impact, the negative impact of those policies and practices on the workers, and understanding the reality, you know, retrofit and go back and change it. So we anticipate that there should be a positive impact. But it is hard. It is a hard thing to measure, and everybody's basically thinking about how to do that. But I think that the key point is to work with the stakeholders and with the affected people to identify the ways that they've been impacted and how together we can change that, and that will increase the likelihood, obviously, to have a positive impact. I'm not sure I answer your question, but it is the one question that everybody has.
Yeah, that is great. Andy, do you have any, Andy or Helen, do you have anything to add to that, of any examples you've seen?
Just a couple of thoughts from me. I used to work at a retailer that was part of the Oxfam Behind the Barcodes initiative, and so Oxfam was very important in driving changes to how we worked. And as Monica said, I think it is the $1 million question. What does undertaking a human rights impact assessment or undertaking other interventions actually do for workers on the ground? And I think I'm not necessarily going to answer that question, but I think it comes back to one of the points that came through the Waitrose work, which was that so much of this is dependent on really high quality worker engagement. So engaging with the organizations that workers trust most, using real expertise in how you interview workers and engage with workers. So I think one of the real areas of progress is improving the way we engage with workers, improving the extent to which we have ongoing relationships with trade unions, workers' organizations, so we get the most accurate picture of conditions for workers that we possibly can. Because when you undertake social audits or other types of assessments, you can get such a spectrum of results depending on how that exercise is carried out.
Yeah, I can jump in. So we assess a lot of companies on this topic. So I think there was also a question in the chat about examples of best practices, and we do have a list of best practices on our website, and I can share the link. But for example, I'm just looking now, I see that one of Australia's largest retail companies called Coles Group, they have an interesting case study or an interesting approach to this. And I think a British alcoholic beverage company called Jaguar also has some interesting examples. So there are examples of best practices out there that companies can look at, and I'd be happy to dive into those in more details at another session if that's helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Please drop those in the chat. So I do see a question here also for you, Monica. Any initiative you know of implementing Oxfam human rights impact assessment in the seafood sector?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, we've just conducted one in South America. It's in the final stages. I was marginally involved just in the last stages of the impact assessment, so I'm not the person who did it, but yeah, so it was done both on vessel and processing plants, and some of the risks that I described before also were identified there. And as I was saying, we're in the final stages. We have discussed the preliminary findings with the stakeholders all along the value chain, and workers, of course, and government. And we're now in the phase, my colleagues, of detailing the action plan with the company, the commissioning company, to then decide, figure out what kind of measures to take. So yeah, and it will be public at some point. So we can make sure to circulate with this group as well.
Yeah, I think we'd all be really interested in seeing that. So yeah, please keep us in mind when that is public. There's another question I'm just going to give it to all the panelists. And it talks about, can you outline what you consider the most important features of a functional grievance mechanism? I'm aware of many ineffective efforts and some that put whistleblowers and victims further at risk.
Sorry, I can go next if you want. Yeah, so I said we've done actually a lot of work in the last year or so, working directly with companies and some of their suppliers. So we've developed a guidance that we tested. So we have very first-hand experience on the challenges and what good looks like. First of all, I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but engaging with the workers, I mean, it is that's the real, the biggest rule. Engaging with the workers to identify what works for them and what doesn't. So in many cases, companies that we've talked to thought that there were no issues because they did have a grievance mechanism in place, but they didn't receive any grievances, so everything is good. And then we put them to sit down with the workers and they start having conversations and learn that, oh, actually, no, there are issues, but they don't feel they can bring them to us for a variety of reasons. So identify what those reasons are and then removing those barriers and create channels that actually work for them. Really, really important, the confidentiality and allowing for anonymous grievances. It is a challenge for companies and companies were telling us, well, but we want to know who they are so we can address the issue and provide remedy. But in many cases, actually, that is a big barrier, right? So we the challenge is like, right, let's give the option of raising the grievances anonymous. So you start receiving some of the issues that come to the surface. You can find ways to address them, maybe across the board. Maybe if it's an issue about supervisors yelling at their workers, then you can think about a communication training for supervisors, something like, even if it's not individual, you can still address the root cause. And that will build trust in the system. That's the key, how you build trust from workers in the system. So things like that, and showing the results and showing that people are using it and there is no negative consequences on them and that actually some positive results are coming, that will then reinforce, and then you might see more and more issues coming. Also be open to receive very small issues at first, just complaints or suggestions, because people are testing the system before they come maybe with a very strong abuse. So creating that, and then in terms of trust, legitimacy, I said that quickly before, really involving workers or communities in the implementation of the mechanism. Have worker representatives involved, being one of the point of reference for the mechanism. Have workers involved in identifying the solution so that you hear their perspectives. In many cases, companies would say, well, the human resource department is best equipped to address those issues. And it's true to some extent, but then it's really seen as part of the company. So create that space for workers to be engaged and involved. I'll stop here. I could talk forever, but I'll let others jump in.
I'd certainly agree with Monica there on the involvement of workers. So we've just had the Fair Food Programme visiting the UK, and they were describing how their grievance process works, and it very much has involved workers in the development of it, in the implementation of it. Workers are involved in the inspections or audits that take place. So I think that's really important. And then subsequent to that, I would just provide some interesting feedback we got from one of our members who was piloting grievance mechanisms. They said that the word grievance was quite contentious when they were introducing it to colleagues within the organization, and slightly reframing it as a tool for ongoing worker engagement that wasn't just about really severe abuses, but was about, different ways to communicate with workers, and for workers to communicate with management is potentially a way to deal with that.
That's a great point, and a great finding to take forward with us for sure. Well, with that, I just want to thank the speakers again for your participation today, and for those that are able to attend the call. We will have our next webinar on responsible recruitment on December 1st. So you will be seeing emails about that. So please sign up and participate in that. So thank you again for joining, and thank you to our wonderful speakers today. Take care.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks everyone for attending.